Creating Personal Boundaries, Part 2. In this two-part video set, PIa discusses the nature of boundaries, including the purpose, the components, and the creation of a full system. Boundary violations are also explained, and PIa shows how to evaluate your own boundaries.
Okay, in the previous tape, I talked to you about what the external physical boundary was about and what the external sexual boundary was about. Now I want to go explain the internal boundary. The internal boundary is actually much more difficult for most people to create for themselves. And so I want to spend some time really talking to you about this. Well, let's go through the statement for the internal boundary. The first part of it says, I create what I think and feel and am in control of what I do or don't do. Now, what that statement really says is that I am responsible for how I create myself. I cannot blame you for what I have done over here. In other words, this is what really goes on for people, I believe. What we all do is we scan our environment all the time, and we're taking in all kinds of stimuli. We're taking stimuli in through our eyes, in through our nose, in through our tongue, in through our skin, and in through our ears. We're always taking data in like that, and we assign it meaning. What we want to do, actually, it's kind of a natural thing, what we want to do is blame people for the emotional response we get from how we're assigning meaning to incoming data. The other thing we want to do in our immaturity, really, is not only blame them for how we created ourselves, the other thing we want to do is control that out there so that we create meaning that creates comfort for ourselves. That's where the glitch is. Are you following me with that? And the first part of this internal boundary statement says, disputes what I just told you. It says, I create what I think and feel and am in control of what I do or don't do. Inherent to that is you are not responsible for how I am taking in data, assigning it meaning, and creating my emotional health. I am responsible for that, even if it is in reaction to what you're doing out there. It's very hard for us to take in. It's very hard for us to do that, especially with a person that is very close to us. We want to blame others. The closer somebody is to us, the more often we blame them for how miserable we are making ourselves. Now, let me add another component here. For people who are very codependent or very immature, and who've had a lot of child abuse in their family of origin, how they give meaning to incoming data oftentimes is very, very skewed, especially around people that they're very close to, which is another reason why it makes it hard to not blame or externalize your problem and fail to use your internal boundary around those that are very close. Okay, now, this statement here, I create what I think and feel and am in control of what I do or don't do, pushes energy in what direction? Does it push energy away from me, or does it push energy towards me? Now look at it real carefully. I create what I think and feel and am in control of what I don't do or don't know. In other words, I take responsibility for me. Does that push against me or push against the other person? Pushes against you. It contains me. It says, I am responsible for me, and I can no longer blame you for how I'm creating me. The second part of this internal boundary statement is, the same is true for you. So when I'm using that part of my boundary, what I'm saying to myself is, oh, there you are over there. And if I'm listening to you, I'm going to notice your body. I'm going to notice your thoughts, if you express them. I'm going to notice the emotions if you let those out. And as I am making this part, the same is true for you. In other words, I'm not going to take responsibility for how you're whacking yourself out. Means that as I watch you do that, I'm not going to make myself responsible for it. You are responsible for how you've created yourself today. I am responsible for me. Now this part of it, the same is true for you. In other words, you create what you think and feel and are in control of what you do or don't do. I'm not. That part pushes the energy against the other person. For example, if Barbara's here, that would push energy against her. And what I do with that is I make her responsible for how she's creating herself. I make myself responsible for how I create me with the first statement. And in doing that, I can what? I can detach from Barb. I can let her be who she is as I'm able to do that. And I can also let myself be who I am. I don't have to be fake in front of Barb. I can be who I am. Because even if she takes responsibility for it, I don't have to accept the fact that she's taking responsibility. If she's blaming herself, I just see her inner disease. And I don't blame myself for what she's doing. See? Now that's hard to do. We want to blame. It's a defense against dealing with the environment. Now, remember I mentioned in tape 1 the issue of using a defense to guard against reality. Remember I said rationalization, blaming, minimization, denial. That blaming is one of those defenses, and I want you to think about it from now on as a very unhealthy thing to do. And remember, whenever you're blaming, making somebody else wrong for what's happened in the environment, what's actually going on is you're in internal boundary failure. You are in internal boundary failure and experiencing your disease of codependence. I've noticed when people first start learning boundaries, they discover their internal boundary is about in failure most of the time if they're looking at somebody else and there's any kind of conflict. Okay? So that's what the internal boundary says. Now, there's a caveat here that goes along with the internal boundary statement. We need only note the impact our reality has had on the other person. Now, that's a very, very important thing to remember. Because if you don't add that to the full boundary statement, you'll have a tendency to, when you're using your internal boundary, to appear to be shining the other person off, if you get the drift of what I mean. In other words, when I'm using my internal boundary, I say to myself, if Barb were here, well, Barb, why don't you come up here, because it's easier if you're standing here for people to visually see that. Just stand right there. Right there. Okay, now, as I'm using my internal boundary with Barb, what I'm saying is, she creates herself, I create me, and I don't have to be responsible. But if I don't add, I need to note the impact I've had on her. We both need to note the impact we've had on each other. If I don't add that, there's a tendency to use it as a wall. It's like, screw it, I don't have to pay attention to it. But when you add, even though I won't take responsibility for how Barb has created herself today, I do need to note the impact I've had on her. Or I do need to note, this is very important, I need to note, as I'm having my internal boundary, how she has taken me in, assigned my behavior meaning, and created an impact within herself. I've got to note that. If I'm not willing to note it, then my internal boundary will become a wall. And she'll have the sense when I'm using it that I'm just kind of ignoring it. How does she get the feeling I'm not ignoring her? Because when I'm noting the impact, I am listening. She'll have the sense that I'm listening as I note the impact. I don't just shine her off. Well, that's you. And you know what people will do if they don't have this little caveat there, what happens is they'll be in an exchange with somebody else using their internal boundaries, and what they'll do when they hear something they don't like is they'll say, well, that's more about you than it is about me, which is essentially what I'm talking about when I say shining somebody off. You can't do that. You have to note the impact even though it's unpleasant to look at. So you have to look at it being unpleasant oftentimes, but you still don't have to take responsibility for it. Do you see how when you do your internal boundary, you're actually doing like a toe dance on the top of a needle? Very hard to balance yourself, not taking responsibility for it, but still noting it anyway and letting them have their reality. Now, interesting thing is with this internal boundary, as Barb and I do that with ourselves, or I use mine with Barb, and I'm noting the impact I'm having on her, paying attention to it, noting it, but not taking it in. What does that set me up to do with Barb? It sets me up to love her, because it sets up a real respectful exchange here. Well, I don't have the burden of responsibility for who she's made herself to be today. And through my boundary, though, I will listen. I can hear her. I'm respectful of her. I'm holding her in warm regard, even if she may be confronting me with something very unpleasant, because I'm detached from her, and I can let her be, which is a very respectful position to be in. It's a loving position to be in. If I don't have that internal boundary, what happens to me is whenever Barb is having an opinion about me that I know she's made up, you know what I mean? I'm going to have more of a tendency to get in here and try to what to do to her. I'm going to try to control what she's telling me if I'm taking responsibility for it and it's negative and something I don't want to hear. But when I can detach and know I'm not responsible for it, but still be able to note it, even if it's a difficult confrontation, we are drawn together, and she can hear it, and I can hear it, and we don't have to get into some real toxic intimacy here. Turns out to be a healthy, loving thing, even though what may be being discussed is very difficult to hear. Thanks, Barb. Okay, now let me talk to you, going back to how to create your boundaries. Let me show you that it's a 1, 2, 3 punt kind of experience. The first thing is that I think you need to spend some time visualizing those two boundaries so that when you get in a glitch and you're having to use your boundaries under a lot of stress, that you can close your eyes for a moment and see those two boundary systems in your mind's eye. The second thing you have to do is memorize these statements here, right here. And not only memorize them so they come up for you very quickly, you have to memorize them with understanding. You have to really get what they mean and take them into yourself. You have to understand them, believe them, and take them into yourself. Once you've done that, then you can go on and put them into action, which is the 3 in this. 1, 2, 3, do it. This is the doing of it, the third part. Do it. Now, let me digress just a minute and talk about this last sentence here under the 3 boundary statements. And that is, if one of us acts as a major offender, the person doing the offending is accountable for the impact and owes the other an amends. Now, what that means is that in an intimate exchange, if one of the people in the exchange has violated the external physical boundary, or the external sexual boundary, or the internal boundary, the one who is the violator owes the other an amends, and needs in owing the other and in giving the amends is actually being accountable for the fact that they have violated the other person's boundaries. So this is a component of having a full boundary system, that when you get caught having violated somebody's boundaries, you are not responsible for how they've responded completely, but you are accountable for the impact and therefore owe the other an amends. And in a 12-step process, what we're talking about here with this statement is about doing an 8th and 9th step with the other person. The boundary violations are not okay. I haven't explained to you what they are. I'm going to later. So another part of having your full boundary system is not only have a visual idea of them, having memorized and understood these statements, the other thing you have to also notice or commit to memory are what boundary violations actually are, so that if you get confronted about violating somebody's boundary, you have the ability to know that and can offer an amends. Amends being an acknowledgement that you did it, and a pledge to work not to do it again. Okay? Now, how to make this all operational? Well, let's discuss number 3 here. In terms of the external physical boundary, let me talk about how to do it. The first thing you need to do when you're establishing boundaries and really going to make them operational is be sure you always begin with the physical external boundary. That's the first one you want to work on. And that is because your internal boundary will not work if your external physical is not in place. So when you think about starting it up, remember it's my recommendation that you begin with the external physical boundary. Then you can move to your external sexual or your internal boundary. Okay? Now, some people are incest survivors or survivors of rape or sexual molestation, and maybe at a point in their recovering process where they haven't done sufficient detoxification work from their sexual abuse. And so they're at a period of time when they're using a sexual wall and not trying to negotiate sexual experience. And if that's the